start the recording. As we speak, he joins. That is, I think, excellent. Is this Professor Zubok? So, Vladislav? I'm not sure if we potentially, or is this a different Vladislav? It might still be. We did have a couple of Vladislavs who did register, of course. It's not the most uncommon name. No, I do believe, unfortunately, he will not be joining us. Anyway, what I would start with is to thank everyone for joining us today. We're very happy to welcome you to this discussion on the legacy of empire for Russian foreign policy. My name is Philippe Lefebvre. I'm the chair of the Institute for Greater Europe, and we are a youth-led think tank based in Brussels with members all across Europe and beyond. This is an event we're hosting related to our project with Professor Zubok will be joining us in a bit. He just has some technical difficulties. This is an event we're hosting related to our project with the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum and their Europe Lab series. We chose today's topic to explore a key area of interest for our research, that of Russian foreign policy and the intertwining it has with its neighborhood, whether that's part of a former Russian empire, a union of Soviet socialist republics, or in spheres of influence. With a growing understanding of post-socialist and post-colonial studies into the region, we wanted to bring together a fantastic panel of academics and ask them their thoughts on the legacy of empire and its influence on contemporary Russian policy abroad. With this, I want to introduce our wonderful panel we have today. Firstly, I want to introduce Professor Morozov, a native of Eastern Kazakhstan. Professor Morozov has a long and distinguished career teaching international relations, Russian foreign policy, and EU-Russian relations. A researcher in post-structuralism and post-colonial theory, he's now Professor of EU-Russia Studies at the Johann Skytt Institute of Political Studies at the University of Tartu in Estonia. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Morozov.
Thank you.
And next, I wish to introduce Dr. Merlin, lecturer at the Faculty of Philosophy and Social Sciences at the University Libre of Brussels. Her research focuses on social, political, and identity transformations in the post-Soviet space, especially in the North Caucasus, and has published frequently on the question of post-conflict in the Caucasus and Chechnya themselves. We're very happy to have her joining us today and bringing her unique research to the panel. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, although he may be delayed, we do have Professor Zubok. I will give him the introduction nevertheless. Professor of International History at the LSE in London, with an expertise in the history of the Soviet Union. He's published frequently on the Cold War and consulted in films on the matter with regular frequency. He is currently working on a book on the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we look forward to having him join in that respect. Without further ado, I wish to give the panel to Professor Morozov to start, followed by, hopefully, joins Professor Zubok, and finally, Dr. Merlin. After this, there will be some time for comments by our panel, and then we'll open the Q&A alongside a few pre-submitted questions. Thank you again, and Professor Morozov, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. It's an interesting topic, obviously, and an interesting lineup of speakers. But in the best academic tradition, let me start by questioning some of the premises of this debate today. Talking about imperial legacies in Russia's foreign policy implies that imperial legacies are somehow singled out and are considered as a special case, something that normally you either don't have or you somehow suppress them and so on. My first point would be that, as a matter of fact, empires have been probably more typical and, in a certain sense, a norm in the global history, in global international history. And the nation state, which we usually take as a norm, was an exception. Empire, in a certain sense, is a more natural way of organizing things because it's hierarchical. It also takes into account the diversity of the cultural, religious, linguistic diversity, and it doesn't promote inequality. It treats each group separately, and so on. So in that sense, of course, every major polity, every major state today has imperial legacies in the sense that they've been part of a certain imperial hierarchy, not necessarily as the leading part, as the leading player, but definitely they have experienced imperialism and colonialism in one way or the other. My second point would probably be slightly less trivial, and that's the fact that, well, let me just add one point. Sorry about that. One more point to the previous argument. What makes empires problematic for us is that they are, of course, not very compatible with democracy. Because democracy, as we understand it, presupposes equality, and that means that you need a certain different type of political organization. And the only one which so far we have found, we have identified, we have developed is the nation state. The only one which is compatible with democracy. There might be others, and actually it might be a good idea to look for other forms of political organization that could be democratic. But empires, due to their hierarchical nature and due to their tendency to differentiate between subjects and treat them as subjects rather than citizens, obviously is not conducive to democracy. So moving to my second point, I tend to view Russian Empire as part of a multi-layered global imperial order of modernity, which was established mostly by European powers as they started to develop capitalism in early modernity. And modernity, of course, is in a certain sense core dimensional with capitalism, and also temporarily they coincide, and there is the same dynamic that we have there. So basically what we have is, in global historical terms, once again, Russian Empire was part of this global imperial hierarchy. And we also should treat empires not just as certain areas on the map. That is actually misleading. Empires are probably better understood in a three-dimensional, maybe even four-dimensional picture, if it's possible at all to imagine something four-dimensional for us. But what is important is that these hierarchies are always there, and local imperial orders might be subjugated to the more global ones. And this was exactly the case with the Russian Empire, because as I call it in my book, following Madina Tlastanova's formula, Russia was a subaltern empire, in the sense that it was an empire on itself, a sovereign polity, but it was also integrated as a subaltern, as a subordinate part into the global imperial order, capitalist order, led by European powers and later by the United States. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, of course, was a very special empire. But what made it exceptional was its non-imperial qualities. You may call it affirmative action empire following Terry Martin. You can probably pick a couple of other formulae. But what is still important about the Soviet Union is that it had a certain anti-imperial and anti-imperialist ideology, and even being de facto by virtue of its organization, an imperial polity, or at least a polity with strong imperial elements combined with certain other with something based on the model of nationhood and national statehood, and maybe some sui generis elements. It was, of course, a very special polity as an empire. Nevertheless, it definitely inherited many features and also material legacies of the Russian Empire, such as the territory, such as, large part, the bulk of the imperial territory. Also, institutional infrastructure, certain discursive patterns, identity patterns, and so on. And in that sense, the Soviet Union continued as a very special, but still subordinate and intermediary, semi-peripheral part of the global imperial order. And some elements of that actually became even stronger, especially towards the end of the Soviet period, when the Soviet Union started to slowly return back to normality, as some people would call it, slowly started to take up or return to consumerist, capitalist, and I would argue even neoliberal values towards the end of its existence, the Soviet Union also became more dependent in certain respects on the core due to oil and gas development in Western Siberia in particular. And this oil money was something that maybe prolonged its existence, maybe on the contrary, made it shorter and eventually led to the Soviet collapse, or at least contributed to the Soviet collapse. But the main point from my point of view is that indeed the Soviet Union was, to a large extent, a polity that was dependent on the core, and its entire material infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, transportation infrastructure was in a certain sense not just based on a certain imperial model per se, but it was part of the global capitalist order oriented towards raw materials production and transportation from Siberia, mostly Siberia, but also some other parts of the country, depending on which resources we're talking about, to the West, and then in exports mostly in the Western direction, or predominantly actually in the Western direction. So I think this is the background against which we have to look at the Russian imperial legacies and their influence on Russian foreign policy. And to me, what matters, once again, are certain objective facts, certain objective realities that in a certain sense, any Russian government would have to deal with. Look at labor migration, for instance. I mean, given the structure, the economic structure of Northern Eurasia, I think it would have been almost inevitable that such patterns of labor migration would develop, even if Russia was a much more democratic country and much less imperialist in its foreign policy. It would still probably attract labor from Central Asia, Moldova, Belarus, and other countries because it's resource rich. This is where the money is. Moscow is where the money is mostly, and then of course it kind of trickles down and goes into other areas, and also trickles down in social sense, in the social space. And this what makes in many respects those countries dependent on Russia. Then there are also cultural legacies, such as the knowledge of the language, such as certain cultural patterns that were inherited from the Soviet time. Of course, these countries are moving increasingly apart, and there is also a growing national consciousness today, and we are no longer in that situation where we were part of a single cultural space. By all means, they're definitely moving apart. But at the same time, we should not underestimate the importance of those legacies. So I'm not saying this to justify any actions that Russia undertook recently in its foreign policy, but I'm just saying that it's important not to forget about those material legacies and also discursive structural legacies, more generally speaking, that create the background and that make it easier for certain regimes, or maybe for any regime, they would actually be, in a certain sense, imperative that you have to deal with those legacies. You have to somehow deal with the problem of Russian speakers abroad, for instance. You would have to deal with the problem of labor immigration and somehow accommodating those people and so on. And at the same time, of course, there is a difference, I believe, between how the current Russian regime handles those issues and how a democratic Russian government would handle those issues. But those issues will be largely the same, and the final part, of course, is that any future Russian democratic government, even if it doesn't want to be imperialist, would still have to deal with the legacies not just of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union as an empire, but also of Putin's Russia as this kind of neo-imperial polity that also has engaged in expansion. I think I'll stop here, and I'm ready to tackle also to take up any questions about concrete policies and foreign policy moves. But I think we better save this for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. And indeed, we do have some pre-submitted questions on that matter, so we'll definitely come back to it. I'm glad to say that Professor Zubok can join us. So thank you very much, Professor, for dealing with the houses of technology. And I now wish to yield him the floor and look forward to hearing everything you have to say. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. Indeed, I should only reiterate what Alexander has just said. Whatever government will be in Moscow, well, ultra-liberal or even libertarian, the problems of the legacy will not go away, as well as the problems of geography and geopolitics. I know some of my friends in Moscow of liberal inclination simply cannot tolerate this word geopolitics, but I always tell them, you know, you can hate the word, but please take realities into account somehow. Well, I was always influenced when I look at the legacy of Russian Empire by what my great friend Alfred Reber had once called persistent factors, and I will not go through this now, but I would rather want in my, 15 minutes to focus on specific things that I found in my own research, as I have just finished a book called Collapse, The Fall of the Soviet Union. It will be out in November, published by Yale University Press. And it's a pretty hefty book with lots and lots of details. So what struck me is how exactly the Soviet Union collapsed. And of course, we know in general details how it happened. But first of all, the process was really, really quick, completely unexpected. And whatever our friends from the Baltic states and Ukraine say, it imploded from the core. And Moscow played a huge role in this process of implosion. I should also mention that there's some political and semantic schizophrenia when you mention Moscow, for instance. When you mention the Kremlin, Moscow was a seat of a Soviet post-totalitarian, call it this way, power and a de facto unitary state, even in 1985 when Gorbachev assumed power. Yet since 1989-90, Moscow also became a seat, a hotbed, I would say, of Russian liberalism and separatism, of course, represented by Yeltsin and the movement called Democratic Russia. So from the viewpoint of the Balts, Ukrainians, Georgian nationalists, and so on and so forth, liberal Democrats in Moscow were crucial allies, particularly for the Balts. It's enough, you know, you can go and ask Arnold Rüütel in Estonia or Edgar Savisaar, also in Estonia, how much help they got in gaining independence from not only Yeltsin, a number of individuals. Yet at the same time, of course, for many Estonians and the Balts and Georgians and the Western Ukrainians, particularly Moscow was the symbol of imperial and colonial domination. So this schizophrenia, I guess, reached the peak in 1991, and it seemed to go away after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but quickly resurfaced later on. And that's an interesting phenomenon to explore in itself. So for the West, another thing that I should mention in terms of semantic, that when Yeltsin and his democratic liberal assistants came to power and got rid of Gorbachev, they thought that the West would embrace a democratic Russia immediately. And in fact, the first request that Yeltsin, Gennady Burbulis, his top strategist, and others made in December 1991, after dissolving the Soviet Union, was Russia wants to be NATO. We destroyed the greatest totalitarian empire of the 20th century, Russia is different from this empire. So for them, the Soviet Union was an absolutely antithetical to Russia. Well, they should have read Western literature, which that's what they didn't. Because in Western literature, and particularly in informal political discourse, somewhere inside the White House or the Elysee and other seats of power, Russia was the Soviet Union. And of course, Russians were used more often in Cold War documentation among diplomats, intelligence, and political strategists than the Soviets. Or at least they were used interchangeably. So we have here a strange disparity for Yeltsin, Bourbolis, and others. They destroyed the Soviet Union. That means they liberated Russia to become a democratic country that could join the West. For the Western and especially American statesmen, such as George Bush, the president, and his Secretary of State Baker and National Security Advisor Scowcroft, that was nonsense. How could Russians be so irrational and unreasonable to destroy their own state, which of course was the Soviet Union? So the Russian leadership and elite in 1991 had fascinating discussions about how they would correct all the mistakes and all the errors of the totalitarian empire, how they would join the family of democratic nations, how they built completely different, equal, nice relations with the neighbors. But of course, other republics if they decide to leave the Union. So we learn a lot, and I think we should learn a lot from looking closer to the documents that remain from those discussions. I should say that there was never a unanimity, especially how to behave vis-a-vis neighbors, and especially former republics of the USSR, such as Ukraine. There was a group of more, let's call them nationalist and state-minded people who, of course, thought in terms of interests. Russia, of course, will have interests, including, geopolitical interests, and that dictates certain sphere of influence, a certain natural domination of Russia because it's so big, so rich, so massive towards smaller countries around it. At the same time, they try to somehow marry this fact, geopolitical fact of Russia's, large mass and smallness of its neighbors to the ardent desire to join NATO and other Western institutions. And when we look at these debates, we discover that they could never find a logical link. They could never overcome the contradiction between the former and the latter. Even such well-meaning people as Andrei Kozyrev, the first and quite liberal-minded foreign minister of the Russian Federation, could not do it. And I read very carefully his memoirs, full of bitterness and disillusionment. The memoirs corroborated to me again that even Kozyrev do not know how to do it. His ideal, as he said in an interview, would be for Russia to become another Canada. But Russia is not Canada, and even geographically, it borders China on one, and of course, all these smaller countries form the Finland and Baltics and others, and then of course Europe. So it's impossible to this problem to deal with Russia's neighbors. For most of people around Yeltsin, I would say, even for Yeltsin himself, Moscow and Russia, without any doubt, would eventually become a natural dominant point of influence for the neighbors, including the Baltic states, I should stress, including the Baltic states. Only at the time, we're talking about 1991, warned that alienation and immediate distancing of all newly independent states from Moscow, Russia, and automatic search for allies in the West, and above all, in the United States overseas. That would simply counterbalance Russian dominance and Russian business. Tara Vojtova, Yeltsin's advisor, brilliant woman, who spoke at the time about the natural process of self-determination, especially for the Balts, for South Caucasus and Ukraine. She believed, however, that this process of alienation for Russia, distancing for Russia, while natural and while inevitable, would somehow be temporary, transitional. It would pass. Maybe it would take a couple of generations. Maybe, it would be shorter, but it would pass, considering and given almost nearly perfect behavior on Russia's part. And let's say if Russia would play the role as Germany played the role since the 60s, being very good and perfect towards all its neighbors, right? So Russia, of course, never became Germany, as we know. Another interesting example of skepticism we find by looking at Georgy Shakhnazarov, Gorbachev's advisor, an Armenian wise man. So in Shakhnazarov's view, he argued with Yeltsin's assistance just a few months before the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the collapse would be tragic for everyone, because while the republics are still in the Union, doesn't matter, confederation, something else, there is still a historic chance to keep that commonality between them. Once you dissolve the Soviet Union, there would be no more chance. He said Soviet republics would be pulled into the orbit of other alliances, above all into the orbit of NATO. In his mind, it was as much ABC, as simple as ABC, the product of history as well as geopolitics. So, in his view, no amount of Russian good behavior, no amount of Russian, recanting and, confessing the guilt for the past would prevent this scenario from happening. So what do we have? The last 30 years, of course, mutatis mutandis shows that Russia was not Germany and behaved sometimes really, really badly, and towards our times quite awfully. But what Shakhnazarov's scenario was inevitable, even without Russian shenanigans and Russian bad behavior. I tend to think so. Maybe it's the nature of me being a little bit more pessimistic, a little bit more conservative lately. First of all, I think the suddenness and trauma of the Soviet political collapse is impossible to ignore. The fact is that things proceeded so amazingly quickly, and there was so little room for negotiations. We know, for instance, that Yeltsin simply recognized the Baltic states and then Ukraine unconditionally as independent sovereign states. Yet, of course, we know that even the partition of India and Pakistan that proceeded also rapidly, but with the help of the mediator, the United Kingdom, led to huge conflict. And it would be highly idealistic and unrealistic to expect that such suddenness and such completeness of the state's collapse could lead to a smooth process. Nobody actually expected it. Everyone expected a nuclear Yugoslavia. And then when it didn't happen, praised each other and pat each other on the back and said how much, how lucky we are that we avoided this awful, awful scenario. But of course, other awful scenarios that did take place paled in comparison to nuclear Yugoslavia. And so that was a very useful position to take at the time. We all know what happened immediately as the Soviet Union was still on its last legs. Russian-Ukrainian feud over Crimea, over the Black Sea Fleet, over nuclear weapons. Russian-Georgian Abkhazian conflict. the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and so on and so forth. And of course, tension with the Baltic states, despite good friendly relations between Rutel, Savisaar, and Yeltsin, and Kozyrev and other Democrats. Another, last point I would like to act, I'm aware of time, is economy. Most of us do not understand economy, do not study economy, and do not make good money. Well, some people know how to do it and understand economy. So my suggestion is, if we look at economic aspects of the Soviet collapse, that is the most amazing aspect of the collapse, because empires disintegrated before, but they never disintegrated so disastrously in economic sense, I would say. Well, maybe maybe some people say the Austria-Hungary collapsed in 1918, and it was really, really terrible. I found, by the way, that some people who studied Austria-Hungary in 1918, they came to Moscow in November 1991 and advised Yegor Gaidar, the man who actually prepared a shock therapy for Russia. And so the parallel with Austria-Hungary is quite interesting. But still, it is astounding to see how much the process of sovereignization and building new states in Ukraine, Baltics, and so on and so forth was coterminous and sort of conditioned with by destruction of economy, helped by the fact that many people at the time, I mentioned Gaidar and many others, who said, "Oh, get rid of all this economy. It's bad economy. It's misconstructed economy. We should raise it to the ground and then build the correct, nice, proper economy." Hard to believe that people could say it at the time, but 1991 was a revolutionary year. So they did destroy their own economy. They destroyed defense corporations, pipelines, empires, and basically cut them along Republican lines. Some of the things were spared. Some of the things were, was possible to save through hasty negotiations on high level. Yeltsin conducted such talks with Kravchuk of Ukraine. Vice President Rudskoy less successfully conducted negotiations as well, and so on and so forth. It would be fascinating to look at the Baltic case, which is understudied, but most of the time, the overall view is one of destruction. Overall kind of attitude, destroy the economy. What do you expect when you keep destroying sinews of economic power, economic assets? You bring up destitution, you create social problems, you magnify the effects of the imperial collapse. So indeed, finishing my brief and slightly disorganized talk, I would say we're lucky we didn't have nuclear Yugoslavia, but my close study thinks that shows that there was not so many chances for such occurrence, such an outcome. On the other hand, when people congratulate themselves and praise the peaceful disintegration of the Soviet Union, they tend to overlook many destructive and traumatic aspects that A, remain understudied, and B, when you begin to study them, reveal a lot of dirty linen and reveal a lot of fuel for conflict between the republics. In other words, republics, as they built their nation states vis-a-vis Russia, above all, they created both political tension with Russia, alienated themselves from Russia, and destroyed their own economic ties with Russia, expecting, that the West would, immediately embrace them and make things happen, which never happened in reality. And so, I'm open for questions. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Professor Zubok. And I think I can agree. I'm glad there was no nuclear Yugoslavia. Merely a term like that certainly elicited a shock. And lastly, I want to yield to Dr. Merlin for her opening statement, I should say. And then afterwards, we'll also allow the professors to respond to each other's comments. So please, Dr. Merlin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. So as I said earlier, since I jumped in on a very short notice, I will probably only give some notes and some inputs after listening to my colleagues. I would like to start by reminding two Soviet jokes. С кем имеет Советский Союз общие границы? With whom does Soviet Union have common borders? Probably you know the answer, yes. So with anyone it wants. And the second one is, why did Soviet Union intervene in Afghanistan? Because Afghanistan starts with a letter and it works in an alphabetical order. And so, and my second preliminary comments will be about what you said, Professor Zubok. I don't know, maybe you don't see me. I don't know how to, is it better like that? Yes, okay. And I found very interesting what you said about the Élysée, the perception at Élysée about Russia, the newly independent Russia. So on the one hand, yes, in the very traditional diplomacy, newly independent Russia was seen probably as the Soviet Union in a very conservative manner. And on the other hand, some policy advisors, some economists, some practitioners within the EU, among others, were seeing new independent Russia as a greatest Poland. Namely, okay, it is a post-communist country, but if we apply some receipts, if we apply some liberal know-how, it will democratize and it will switch to the market economy. And here the imperial legacy was not taken into account. So I mean that the perceptions are navigating between, I would say, two very false ideas. And what I would like to maybe to underline and to share with you what I am coming across when teaching about Caucasus to my students here, that the word colonial or the word empire for them is very unlikely to be used since they have an imaginaire regarding the colonial world. So, and I think that the UN resolution 1514, the 1960 UN resolution regarding the overseas, regarding the ultramarine empires, namely France, Belgium, United Kingdom. So they have the feeling and they take for granted that since there is no this salt water between mainland and the colony, it is really tricky to address the post-Soviet space as a post-colonial situation. And I mean that here, I think that we being scholars, we still have much to do to analyze the very specificity of this post-colonial situation dating back to the Tsarist empire, which was self-defining as an empire. And I agree that the Soviet Union, of course, the Soviet Union was not self-defining as an empire, and it was the contrary, that it was relying on anti-imperialist ideology officially. But as Professor Morozov reminded, Terry Martin describes it as an affirmative action empire. So the empire, the word empire is used there. What I would like maybe to underline or to add for the discussion, that And again here, when we don't have the geographical, very clear border between the mainland and the colony, it becomes quite tricky to distinguish and to identify where does the mainland end, where does the colony start in this territorial piece of Earth. And if taking the case of Chechnya, here I see and I think that comparative research, it is not so far sufficiently developed, for example, between France and Russia and Algeria and Chechnya in the 19th century. But I think that historians, when comparing and when studying Abdelkader on the one hand and Imam Shamil on the other, and how they built up the resistance, how afterwards the anti-colonial discourse was crafted. It is really interesting. So I was listening with a huge interest what you said about Shakhnazarov and about this period, and also about the Balt during the process of the collapse. When when looking at the narrative which Dudayev, for example, developed regarding Russia, it was clearly an anti-colonial discourse. And this anti-colonial discourse was referring to the 19th century, to the Stalin's deportation in 1944, and of course there was a very provocative also challenges, namely when he said that Russia would crawl until Chechnya and would beg Chechnya to be recognized by Chechnya. And of course, there were a lot of absolutely meaningless narratives and speeches, discourses. But what I find interesting, that this anti-colonial discourse was amplified and awoke all the more since it was supposed, all the more since the ethnic issue was supposed to be completely solved thanks to the Soviet ideology, thanks to the Soviet zbliżenie and slijanie, namely the get closer and the fusion of nationalities. So here what I could say, and regarding economy, it is also very interesting because the perception in Russia itself or the perception by Russians themselves regarding economy here is very different from the perception by French people regarding Algeria or by Belgium regarding Congo, that the way the Soviet Union was built with the allocation of economic resources to the peripheries and to the colonies, if I may, has produced or led to a feeling within Russian society and within among Russians that supposedly Russia was deprived from some resources in favor of the peripheral territories, which should be lured and attract and convinced by the Soviet horizon and by this newly political structure. And here I mean that when it comes to today's realities in Russia, when it comes to some kind of revanchism, some kind of Russian nationalism, or I think that it is impossible to analyze the mood of the Russian society regarding the annexation of Crimea, for example, but not only this case, but this case is a very emblematic one, that after the 1990s and after the very chaotic this very chaotic decade, when not only economically but also symbolically the crumble of the collapse and also the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also the loss, I think the very loss of symbolical references, values, and so on, led to the fact that the symbolical resource, and 2014 was very emblematic for this, when the approval rating of Vladimir Putin jumped until 84% and kept very stable for month and month and month, as if it is at the same time, maybe the only and the easiest symbolical resource Russian authorities have to buy the Russian society's approval. And here, I think that it is not only ringing a bell to the legacy, it is also, as it was said earlier, relate to geopolitics. And I mean that this authorities society relationship in Russia could be analyzed through this post-imperial lens, which is not thought out, which is not sufficiently worked out within the society. I was really paying attention to what you said, Viacheslav, about democracy and about the polities. And here, of course, we see how very long-lasting trends keep playing a very important role after this attempt at democratizing, which is now, for some time at least, seems to be over. I think I won't be more long, but we can discuss during the Q&A.
Of course. Thank you very much, Dr. Merlin, and thank you very much to all of the panelists. I wanted to give the other panelists perhaps a chance to respond. Professor Morozov?
Yes, I will be very brief this time. I'll probably just relate to 2 points made by my co-panelists. First regarding Vladislav's point about the destructive and traumatic aspects of the imperial collapse, of the Soviet collapse. Yes, imperial empires tend to collapse with very dire consequences. Although it's interesting to speculate whether it's because of imperial collapse per se, or because empires usually collapse under very special circumstances. You mentioned Austria-Hungary, which is of course a catastrophic situation of the First World War. Then of course you can also refer to the German Reich, and then the Soviet Union. Well, it collapsed by itself, but at the same time, of course, it was clear that probably the resources were exhausted. But I think what made the Soviet collapse particularly catastrophic was the global political and intellectual situation of the 80s, with the neoliberal wave that completely destroyed any value associated with collectivism, collective solidarity, social protection, and so on, an extremely individualist ideology that coincided very well with the large part of the predisposition of the large part of the Soviet intelligentsia, which was rather elitist and in a certain sense, I would say anti-democratic, even though it was a pro-democracy movement, but it was also a deeply elitist and and anti-democratic movement, in the sense that it was very much based on individualist and meritocratic and consumerist ideals, which of course resonated very much with what was going on in the West at that time. And I'm deeply convinced that this was actually part of a single intellectual atmosphere, that even the Iron Curtain didn't make make up an impenetrable barrier in that regard. Secondly, in terms of defining the boundaries of imperial spaces and within imperial spaces, I would very much insist that these spatial boundaries should be drawn in the social space rather than geographical space. I don't think it actually makes a lot of sense, especially in today's world, to again sit in front of a map and try to draw a boundary separating the metropole from the periphery, or the center from the periphery, in any imperial order. I mean, if you look at any contemporary major city, global city, if you want, you will see that the center and the periphery are within this city. Not just different neighborhoods, but also different social strata, and people, you know, performing different social roles, possessing different social capital. It's very visible. The inequality that you see in any contemporary global city, and Moscow would probably be one of the most unequal cities. I mean, it's so glaring, it's so obvious that it's impossible to ignore. And then, of course, you go a few, maybe dozens kilometers away, and you see poverty that is even more striking, and that is actually more visible even in St. Petersburg than in Moscow, because Moscow Oblast is more developed. But if you go just sometimes for 5-10 kilometers outside of St. Petersburg, you will see sharp contrast with the relative prosperity of Russia's northern capital. I would just call upon everyone to be more holistic in our imagination, in how we think about empires. And let's not be too formalistic, not too driven by this. Let's not allow ourselves to be locked within maps. We're very much a product of all those mapping exercises that, of course, empires, by the way, promoted very much, because they needed maps for sort of making sense of their own diverse spaces. But let's also think about, first of all, global orders, and then social orders, and not just spatial orders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Yes, that's a very rich discussion, and so many things that surfaced. And yes, I noticed that some in my close sort of research on how people in the West looked at the Soviet collapse and the emergence of a democratic Russia, that they, of course, a liberal trend, who embraced the democratic Russia as if there were no past. And that's an interesting phenomenon in itself. It's the phenomenon of revolutionary times, when something big collapses. Let's call it an empire. There's a contiguous sort of conterminous rise of revolutionary idealism. People tend to forget about the past. They imagine the future, and this kind of an imagined future democratic Russia was shared surprisingly by American libertarians, by people from the Reagan right wing of Republican Party, and of course many European socialists, naturally, and social democrats. But if you look at the specific constellation of leaders in the West at that time, most of them still looked at the rise of a democratic Russia as, through very wary eyes, because they did not forget what imperial collapse entails. They remember, that generation of leaders remembered what happened after the First World War, in the interwar period. They were old enough to remember this. And this useful experience, I think, made them much more cautious to embrace Yeltsin and all these, brouhaha about a new Russia born from scratch. And those observations I found were amazing. Going back, much more sober, that you couldn't find the similar observations about precariousness of Russian liberal democratic experience. You couldn't find those observations, for instance, when you read the minutes of Democratic Russia movement, or or discussions among Moscow-based liberal intellectuals. I agree with Vyacheslav; they were quite elitist, but they were more directed to the study of the West than their own country, in a sense. That was the trick of history. Those Westernizers, for instance. One of the leaders of democratic Russia was the scholar of the French Revolution, Yuri Afanasyev, and I can continue. Batkin, for instance, was a specialist in Italian Renaissance. Unfortunately, not medieval Russia or Petrine reforms or Stolypin reforms. I searched and didn't find a single expert on Stolypin reforms or the great reforms in Yeltsin's entourage, or Gorbachev's entourage for that matter. And I think it's important. Those people were unprepared for the consequences of the imperial collapse, or call it whatever. Another thing, that on economy, I cannot stress more how irrational for the outside world, but also for a number of clever economists inside the Soviet Union, and a few bankers that existed at the time, much maligned Gerashchenko, who was the head of the state bank, but in my opinion was very savvy individual. They viewed with horror how the drive of the republics, above all, the drive of the Russian Federation towards national sovereignty, entailed, in the eyes of those who searched this national sovereignty, the destruction of common economy. The destruction of common economy. So when Gaidar began to plan his shock therapy, modeled in part after IMF and Leszek Balcerowicz's Polish shock therapy, even Gaidar did not have an idea how destructive would be liberalization of prices and liberalization of currency that he had planned to achieve like that. And he didn't simply understand the destructive consequences of what he was doing according to IMF book. He acted according to IMF World Bank book, but he didn't know the realities of Soviet economy. Super integrated. And the collapse of this economy has no parallels in world modern history. Even the collapse of Austria-Hungarian common economy pales in comparison. Not to mention Germany, that was, after all, a nation state. Yes, it was oppressed by the various aspects, but more by Great Depression and payment of debts. But it didn't come even close to the destruction of Soviet economy in 1991, 1999. And finally, just to conclude my observations, I think we learn more if we operate, if we discuss not only the trinity of democracy in Russia, liberalism in Russia, and nationalism in Russia. We should add statism. Usually statism is translated negatively as державники, державничество. Some chauvinists like Zhirinovsky who, make impossible claims. But indeed, as Vyacheslav mentioned, the 80s is a curious era when all of a sudden a new liberalism comes and tells everyone to forget about the state. And the paradox is the empire collapses and everyone wants to build a state. Yet somehow the state should not intervene into economy. Guys, this is nonsense. This is ridiculous. And this is highly destructive, of course, because in a new state, in a new country, whatever it is, new borders, tariffs, and so on and so forth, the task of the state to build institutions, economic, market, whatever, is colossal, gargantuan, and yet neoliberalism represented by IMF comes in. Oh, well, somehow it will all settle back. And I think involuntary. I don't mean that IMF experts were meant to cause harm to people of the former Soviet Union, not at all. They were just innocent, innocent Americans. Most of them were Americans. Innocent Americans, like we know from Graham Greene, don't want to cause harm, that they cause this harm, and they did. And they did cause colossal harm.
Thank you very much. Dr. Merlin?
Yes, thank you very much for comments. Regarding boundaries, it was really interesting to listen to what you have said, Viacheslav. I would like to remind that in the Russian newspapers after 1996, after the Khasavyurt agreement, which was the ceasefire in Chechnya after the first post-Soviet Chechen war, when there was a round table with representatives of Russian authorities, with Alexander Lebed and Maschadov, the Chechen pro-independence, at that time military commander. After this ceasefire, according to which it was decided that the Russian troops would withdraw from Chechnya, the journalists and the daily papers in Russia, they would put the Chechnya, the Chechen topic, in pages entitled Ближнее зарубежье, near abroad. So it is really interesting to look at it back in a remote manner from now, because under Yeltsin's rule and during these 1990s years, the very geographical identity of the new Russian Federation was not that clear if the press would put Chechnya as near abroad, according to the expression invented by Andrei Kozyrev at the very beginning of the 1990s, when it came to elaborate a new foreign policy. And I think that here, and I would like to take another example regarding the attempt at creating a nation state and the failure to identify it and to build it. When there was this nationalistic anti-Caucasus movement or mood on the Red Square or on the Manege Square in December 2010, Khvatit Karmit Kafkaz, enough feeding the Caucasus. It is really interesting to approach this fever or this expression of anger by some Russians in the line of what I've said earlier. So Russia, Moscow, the Kremlin, Russian authorities, they pay to keep Northern Caucasus and especially Chechnya and Dagestan within the boundaries and the state, the state, but the attempt which Yeltsin made by trying to popularize the word Россияне, namely the political belonging or a civic belonging of people to the Russian state, to transcend the difference between, and which dated back to the Soviet policy of nationalities, to transcend the difference between Chechens and ethnic Russian, or between Avars, Lezgin, or Tatars, and so on, and ethnic Russian. This attempt to create a civilian identity, a civic identity, and a belonging to the state. So when people cry or shout, "Khvatit karmit Kafkaz," it failed. And I think that, yes, I understand what you are saying regarding boundaries, but I wanted to add this, that Northern Caucasus keeps to be perceived by a lot of Russians as some turbulent region, or some unclear boundary, which we don't always know whether it is within or outside. And for example, there is a report, an international crisis groups report about Chechnya, which is entitled "The Inner Abroad." Chechnya, the inner abroad. So I mean that there is a volatility of identity. And I would like to end up by saying that when Vladimir Putin says in April 2005 that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe is the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he adds about what we could call the red feet, if referring to the pieds noirs, the black feet from Algeria, that millions of Russians, of ethnic Russians, they found themselves outside of Russia, in Central Asia, in Georgia, in Armenia, in Ukraine, and so on, abroad overnight. And here again, we see this issue of boundaries. And last but not least, I think that the language, the question of the language could also be another boundary. I mean, not only the social you mentioned, but also another identity boundary. When this claim of sovereignties and this wave or parade of sovereignties started, I mean that what was the most difficult was for Russians, because how to find themselves when there was so much ambiguity, with Moscow being the capital city of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Russia within the Soviet Union, and the capital city of the Soviet Union, or when the Communist Party in Moscow, or the Academy of Sciences, some would not understand, is it the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union or of the Republic of Russia? And for Georgians, so okay, speak Georgian, Kartuli, or for Ukrainians, speak Ukrainian. The language is given or is charged with a very big load of identity, whereas, and I see some friends of mine in Moscow until now saying, so recently it was June the 12th, and they say, okay, we are independent, Russia, but independent from whom? And so, and for Georgians or for Chechens, if the pro-independence movement had been so successful, it has been crushed, but independence has a sense, at least. And I will end up by remembering a discussion I had with Shakhnazarov, by the way, at the Gorbachev Fund in Moscow in, maybe in 1999 or 2001, I don't remember. And when asking him what is the very or the most important thing Russia should pay attention to or work on, and there was a pause, he thought for some seconds, and after seconds of silence said that найти ее идентичность, идентифицировать себя, to find their identity. as a state, as a nation, and so I will end up with that. Sorry for being maybe too long.
No worries at all. Thank you very much. So yeah, we haven't got a huge amount of time for questions, but I hope we can entertain a couple of them. If any of the participants do have questions, put in the chat that you have a question, and then I'll call upon you to ask it. Otherwise, we have a pre-submitted question from Thomas Fleischer, who I don't think is with us today. He talks about a concept that he read from a very popular book, Tim Marshall's Prisoners of Geography. And he asks, how do the speakers view the legacy of empire in conjunction with the Prisoners of Geography argument, namely that Russia has always sought to expand its sphere of control or influence into Central and Eastern Europe as a defense mechanism against the Eastern European flatlands that pose a threat? Now, so obviously, I think this is an argument that really cuts to the core of our question here. This is for all panelists, so I don't know if any of the panelists want to respond to it first, and then hopefully we'll have time afterwards if any of the participants have a question. It's a free-for-all. Maybe Professor Morozov. Oh, or Professor Zubok, if we can, and then after Professor Morozov.
It's the first time if Viacheslav wants to go first, sure.
No, please go ahead. Let's change the order a little bit.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I think the Soviet Union collapsed peacefully to a great extent because this prison of geography was at the time not a popular thesis. Even among the military, the new thinking by Gorbachev spread. They of course disagreed with. They were quite unhappy, but with hasty withdrawal from Eastern Europe. I would emphasize hasty, because that was done within 1 year. And it meant practically the disintegration of the army. But the top military understood the inevitability of it, and that in a nuclear age, the concept of flat lands that became somehow the glacis, whatever, the buffer against the invasion of land armies, lost its significance to a great extent. So I think that Gorbachevian philosophy of let's rethink security dilemma worked at least for a while and helped peaceful end of the Warsaw Pact, and to an extent even peaceful disintegration of the Soviet Union. Had people thought differently, it would have been not so easy to convince the Russians to support the Baltic independence. Because so many defense installations had been built in the Baltic states. And not to mention Ukraine, to let Ukraine go was absolutely disastrous for the forward-based echelons of the Soviet defense. So my short answer would be, because the Gorbachev's new thinking was successful, at least in this part, it simplified the disintegration of the empire.
Yes, I certainly agree with Vladislav's points. I would just add that I would actually probably go with the argument that Valery Kivelson and Ronald Suni make in their recent book, Russia's Empires, where they describe Russia, the Russian Empire, as an empire of insecurity. But their analysis and the terms that they use are slightly different because they look at institutions rather than geography in pure terms. And what they argue is that we have this traditional image of the Russian Empire as very strong, very centralized, very centrally managed, and so on. Whereas current literature emphasizes the opposite, that it was a very sort of neatly and in a certain sense, a very sophisticated structure, which was very economical and managed this vast space with spare resources. And institutions were actually very thin and very weak, but at the same time, a lot of power was delegated to the local elites, not in the sense, of course, not in a democratic sense, in terms of democratic subsidiarity or something like that, but in terms of constant bargaining and establishing control and kind of patron-client networks, if we use contemporary language, and so on. And that was another element which also, of course, in many cases promoted territorial expansion, because if you had a neighbor next door that was comparable with you in terms of power, then it was easier to somehow conquer them and incorporate them into your domain and make them loyal to you via this system of bargains and patron-client relations, rather than to keep watching the neighbor and feeling insecurity in that regard. But then it means that today it no longer works, because the contemporary situation, starting from, I would say, at least the early 20th century, is very different. And of course, the nuclear weapons, I agree, they add a completely different dimension to this. And now we can add cyber and information and hybrid and whatever you want. I mean, I'm not a big fan of all these concepts, because I think they're quite often overblown. But at the same time, we should, of course, acknowledge the fact that today's insecurities come also from the cyberspace and information space and so on. So there are multiple other dimensions which make geography much less relevant.
Thank you. Dr. Mala, anything you want to add, or should we move to the next question? Okay. Fantastic. So we have one question it's been sent to me from Valentin. Talking about a subaltern empire, what difference does it make to its colonized people that their overlord was subaltern, considering how similar Russian colonization in the Caucasus and Central Asia was to the salt water kind of colonialization, with ethnic cleansing, segregation, and expropriation? More of a technical question there, but it's always nice to get into those.
Yeah, well, but that's not my argument. I mean, I'm not saying that there was any difference, although, of course, in a certain sense, all colonial situations are different, and we have to treat all of them differently, because, I mean, if you look at, even if you compare, for instance, the different saltwater colonizations in the Indian Ocean area, they would all have been different. I mean, the Portuguese came with one mission, the Dutch came with a different mission, the English still with another mission, and the institutional structures, their relationships with the local populations were different, and so on. Look at the German Empire; it was a very sui generis empire. And also, if you look at how local administrators often managed the relations with the sort of native populations, quite often colonialism also included elements of sort of admiration of the local cultures, of course, in an Orientalist mode, but nevertheless. So even within the German Empire, there were vast differences between, let's say, African colonies and Pacific colonies and so on. So what I'm saying is that on the one hand, all colonial situations are different. On the other hand, the fact that your colonizer is in a different situation as subaltern doesn't make any difference to you. It makes a difference to us, because what we need to acknowledge is that the colonizers sometimes colonize not just on their own behalf or on behalf of whatever flag they're carrying, but also on behalf of the system, if you want, of the core, which then actually uses the colonizer to exploit the local resources and to ensure that the reproduction of the global relations and expansion of global capitalist relations continues, and that there is enough resources for that. So, but it's not actually a normative argument. That should not be understood like that. The subaltern empire argument is not a normative argument at all. It's not justifying anyone on saying that colonialism was somehow more benign. Of course not.
Just a few words. I don't think the whole language helps us to understand, the last decades of the Soviet Union, and particularly understand its collapse. This is an example when he tried to export in other, there's scores from other areas and impose them on the material, but the material resists. For instance, just to put it in perspective, the South Caucasus was conquered by Russia before the age of colonialism, largely. I don't know, early age, one can argue, of course. The area that was conquered simultaneously with the building of great maritime empires was Central Asia, of course, the 1980s and so on and so forth. Well, and if you look at the last decades of the Soviet Union, it was the Central Asia that showed the greatest social advancement. Not only in terms of urbanization, industrialization, building infrastructure, but in terms of steady growth of living standards that were far behind the metropole area, not to mention the Baltics, but the Moscow and European part. And those people did not want to secede from the Soviet Union. It took special efforts from by the reformers and the national intelligentsia, virtually prodded from Moscow to organize national separatist movements. Basically, the signal came from Moscow. What perestroika is going on except in Central Asia? Why are you not creating your own people's fronts? Why are you not creating your national parties and so on and so forth? So this is a funny case, and if you go to Tajikistan today, on a level of popular remembrance of the late Soviet period, of course it's subjective and selective, but people remember very fondly the 80s. You would never find such remembrances in Moscow, for instance, because the nature of the Soviet Union was that the periphery, as Aude Merlin reminded us, had to be brought to the level of metropole. And that was really happening in Central Asia, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, with all corruption, all the bad things, with no cotton affair, and so on and so forth. But, it leaves me with the question of deep economic irrationality of anti-colonial movements and the nationalist movements. Economy proceeds according to different laws than nationalism or anti-colonial movements. Now, when you have success of anti-colonial movement, you inevitably confront huge economic problems, because those people essentially, they don't understand economics, or even if they understand, they put the idea of national sovereignty and national independence above it. And of course, economy suffers as a result. I'm not arguing that one should be sacrificed in the name of the other, but this is a paradox that keeps recurring in history. And the Soviet collapse shows it with perhaps greatest level of irrationality. Like, what was mentioned, stop feeding the Caucasians, let's get rid of Central Asia, which I think was a huge mistake on the part of Yeltsin in every possible sense. And Ukrainians did even worse. Ukrainians voted for independence, completely convinced that once they become independent, Ukrainian lard, Ukrainian wheat, and Ukrainian corn would make them the richest nation in Europe. Look at them now.
Thank you. Dr. Merlin, any on that question? Or
what I could just add that, yes, listening to what Vladislav said regarding economy, I mentioned Dudayev, and one of his promises was that oil would, how do you say it in English? Sorry, but would be accessible from kran, ispod kranom. So that when you open your water in your bathroom, you will get oil, because Chechnya was
oil tap. Yes.
But at the same time, yes, I agree with you that this very powerful elixir of sovereignty, independence, the symbolic, the psychologic is above. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that there are not somewhere economists who try to see and to analyze how the newly sovereign entity could become economically sustainable. But as you said, yes, there is an irrationality. What I could add regarding, so I am absolutely not competent to comment the subaltern, the issue of a subaltern empire, but what I would like to add regarding the diversity, that when Russia colonized the Caucasus, also the conquerors, the administrators, they also had to adapt to the different peoples, and especially regarding or according to their social structures, where there is a hierarchy, where there are aristocrats, where there are social classes. It turned out to be more easy for St. Petersburg at that time to organize the integration of territories by co-opting, by drawing elites, Georgians or Armenians, into the Russian army and so on, which was much more challenging with people which don't have this very clear hierarchy. Let's say with Chechens, it was much more tricky for the colonizer. So I mean that, yes, there are diverse models or systems of colonization, but and here in the Caucasus we have a panel, we have diversity, a very interesting diversity. And regarding the period, so Georgiev Treaty and the way Tbilisi was not defended by Russia and of the 18th century, when the Persian invaded Tiflis, and there was already an agreement with Russia, but Russia did not intervene to defend Tiflis, and afterwards there is the Georgiev Treaty to protect, to add the protectorate. So South Caucasus was piece by piece, step by step, integrated or annexated by Russia, and afterwards to securize these new conquest, Russia came to the Northern Caucasus to bridge the gap and to securize. So here we have, yes, different periods when you compare with Central Asia.
Thank you very much. Now, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but what I would like to do is give all of us panelists perhaps a final comment, maybe on the topic, maybe on, although it's dangerous, a ponderance of the future. Will this ever change? Will this legacy actually be dealt with? And we can then wrap up from there. I don't want to necessarily caught you off guard, but maybe we can go in reverse order to the beginning. So Dr. Merlin, followed by Professor Zubok, and then Professor Morozov. Thank you very much. Dr. Merlin, final comments, if you may.
Yes, maybe two things that some days ago, Vladimir Putin asked Ramzan Kadyrov to stay, to remain as the chief of the Chechen Republic. And I think it is a very emblematic case for analyzing this, the Moscow-Grozny relationship, and how how the Kremlin built up this reintegration of Chechnya. So it will be it could be, of course, the subject for a very long discussion, but according to which model and with what kind of appointee. So taking a Chechen guy, relying on some kind of very ancient ethnographic considerations which date back to the way the Russian army and ethnographers within the Russian army considered these peoples and addressed or analyzed the clanic system. That's one thought I could say. And the other is that, to take the Navalny case, that he represent or maybe symbolize maybe something regarding the struggle against corruption. And whether we like it or not, he is also a bearer of a long-lasting reference to this imperial legacy by activating some kind of nationalism. So that may be my final words.
Thank you very much. Professor Zubok?
Yeah, well, I'm glad we mentioned Chechnya many, many times, as well as the Balts, but I want to raise Crimea. If you think everything is clear about Crimea, you're certainly mistaken. And that kind of an issue, I think, that relates to a larger point raised by Viacheslav about sociality and borders. On one hand, Crimea is an anomaly because immediately the poll was taken among the Russians in January 1992, literally days after the declaration that the Soviet Union was null and void. And everyone sort of said, oh, we're concerned with economic crisis. Poor folks, they didn't realize there would be even worse crisis because of the collapse. But it's interesting that people at that time did not link economic crisis to the collapse of the common state and common economy that much. But they raised the issue of Crimea immediately. In that poll, only one territory stood up as being unfairly allotted to another republic. Everything else was okay. The Baltic independence was okay. The independence of Ukraine was all right, and and so on and so forth. The Caucasus, Chechnya still did not stand out despite the recent but the Crimea immediately spiked as a huge aberration because the huge number of common Russians and all focus groups of the Levada Center and at that time FCOM, I guess, thought it's ultimately unfair. And that brings to me the question of borders and irrationality of popular nationalism. I think popular nationalism is fundamentally irrational phenomenon, both economically and in terms of borders and in terms of values of the territories. Because, after all, Crimea has value, there's some resorts, there's some stuff there, some base, Sevastopol, but there's nothing in comparison to the value of the lost, for instance, Eastern Ukraine, or the loss of the Baltics and the maritime ports of the Baltics, or the ports of Ukraine and Nikolaev and Mariupol and so on. But symbolic issue is paramount for popular nationalism, and we see the Crimea is above all as an illustration of that. But on another level, on the level of the elites, the situation is fundamentally different. And here I disagree with my colleague Viacheslav. After the collapse of certainties, and the empire is a great certainty, by the way, it may be very convenient for a great number of people. It can be inconvenient for some minorities, but it's convenient for majorities, certainly, particularly when it lasts for a long period of time. So when these certainties collapse, huge uncertainties emerge, and it's the task of the elites, above all, to reduce these uncertainties. And usually it is after the collapse of the empires when nationalist elites are the most harsh in imposing borders, in imposing tariffs, in counting their subjects, in introducing taxes, and so on and so forth. This happened to India and Pakistan after the Great Partition, with great violence and also internal violence. This happened in Central Europe, as we know, after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in Germany, even before Hitler. And I guess it was inevitably to happen in all the republics of the former Soviet Union, including Russia. So irrationality of popular imagination made Crimea standing out. But rationality of the Yeltsin administration in the 90s had an opposite effect. This is what we see when, despite this huge symbolic value of Crimea, Yeltsin reached agreement with Ukrainians because it was in their mutual interest, Ukrainian elite and the Russian elite, to construct their states and have certainties. And Crimea muddled waters immensely, as we realize today after 2014, how muddling, how confusing, how it's a monkey wrench thrown into everyone's economy, Ukrainian, Russian, and so on and so forth. So this is an interesting case to look at from this perspective.
Yes, I don't think we disagree on the question of certainty, uncertainty, and who wants more certainty and so on. I definitely would agree with you that nation states might be even more, how shall I say, interventionist and intrusive in their handling of populations. But maybe a different lens would be more helpful here, because I think it has more to do with modernity as such, and less with the particular form of governance, whether it's empire or nation state. And definitely, if we go with Foucault in particular and his thinking about biopolitics and governance more generally, then we will see that he actually traces it back to early modernity, and it's not really connected with the particular form, the particular political form that governance takes, but rather with the particular type of thinking that you have to map everything out, that you have to count the population, that you actually treat population as a resource and so on. But okay, that's probably a side point. What I would actually want to bring up maybe as the final remark, although it could have been a topic for a separate conversation like this, is a broader point about memory and how memory works today in, let's say, the post-imperial context, in the context, in particular in Russia, in the context of state propaganda and so on. And it's a very interesting. If you look at the official historical narrative, something that we didn't discuss today, although we could have, then of course the way the contemporary Russian state reinterprets the imperial history, and in a certain sense, I would even claim that it falsifies the imperial history, makes it particularly interesting. And also the way Crimea, for instance, Crimean history is officially remembered is quite an interesting story in itself. That's a different dimension, but I think it's an important dimension of the legacies and how they're processed in the contemporary situation. But of course, I would love to go into detail, but we just don't have time. So I'll just leave there as a question mark maybe for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do enjoy leaving these events with the question marks at the end for people to take home. So it's a good way to end it. All that's left is to thank very much Professor Morozov, Dr. Merlin, and Professor Zubok for joining us today. We hope all of you participants and of course the panelists enjoyed. I can already tell you as the host for this, it was very nice to hear all the conversation in between. And hopefully this will be the start of our event series for the Europe Lab project with the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum. So all I can do is wish everyone a wonderful evening. We hope you took away some new information and understanding for the legacy of empire in Russian foreign policy, and hope you'll stay safe in these troublesome times. Thank you very much again, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.